60 Minutes Rewind.
More than ever, American broadcasting has become an alphabet soup of initials. CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, MSNBC, even FOX, which is a name, not a set of initials. No matter, they're all there all day and all night. But in much of the world, just one set of initials really matters. BBC, known the world over as the Beeb, and listened to the world over more than any other network in the world.
This is London.
For millions around the world, that signature tune and these 5 beeps say Britain as much as Big Ben or Buckingham Palace. But the British Broadcasting Corporation doesn't always mean the Queen's English. Its world service transmits in 43 languages on 43 separate services
Programa do Serviço Brasileiro da BBC de Londres.
to more than 150 million people around the globe, from the streets of Amman to the markets of Mogadishu to the cafes of Kandahar. In many countries, the BBC has even more listeners than the local radio stations. And there's no place where it's more popular than in Afghanistan, where an estimated 80% of the population tunes in. That's why in this country, where many pray 5 times a day, the BBC has become known as the 6th prayer. Perhaps that's because when everyone else abandoned Afghanistan, the Beeb stayed right where it was. During the darkest years, the BBC's William Reeve often found himself the only Western reporter in the country, which was an interesting thing to be.
Once that I was up in the north of the country, and somebody met me, and they said, "Oh, you're William Reeve, are you?" And he said, "I thought you were sort of tall and handsome and all that sort of thing." And I said, "Well, look, I hope I'm not too much of a disappointment when I meet you, but."
The glory of radio.
They have this wonderful image of the BBC.
It was that wonderful image that allowed Reeve to get back into Afghanistan when the air war began last fall. While hundreds of reporters camped out in the north of the country, Reeve was on his way to the capital.
We've reached Kabul at last.
Like most BBC reporters, Reeve speaks the local language. Within hours of his arrival, he was broadcasting to London and to the world on both radio and television.
Otherwise, there's not much people can do, but where do they go? All they can do is stay at home and hope for the best.
From his tone, you'd hardly know he was in a war zone. A massive American bomb had hit the house next door and almost turned the BBC into collateral damage. Reeve's reaction? True blue BBC.
It was quite alarming. Quite alarming.
But not alarming enough for him to consider leaving Kabul. He stayed for weeks and is back there now. But Reeve and the news reports are just part of what attracts Afghans to the BBC. There's a radio soap opera called New Home, New Life, which is beamed into Afghanistan from a BBC studio in neighboring Pakistan. It's not merely popular, it's a national obsession. Shirazuddin Siddiqui, who directs it, has heard people say,
"The BBC is the biggest mullah in the country because everybody listens to the BBC more than they listen to the mullahs."
It's been on the air for 8 years and portrays a simple family in a simple village, dealing with all the trials and tragedies that Afghans deal with every day. Where to find water, how to avoid landmines, how to handle losing loved ones.
They lost quite a lot of other things, and New Home, New Life was the only thing that you could hear people talking about it in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west. Everywhere you went, they had at least one thing in common.
And wherever you go, wherever Pashtun and Persian are spoken, people are listening to his show. During the bleakest days of Taliban rule, when girls' schools like this one were illegal, the BBC soap opera broadcast sounds which were not heard on any Afghan station. Music. the voices of women. Listeners got so involved, they adopted the characters as their own. In fact, after one episode in which a character died, Afghans all over the country were overwhelmed by grief. The headquarters of the BBC, the heart of this beast with 43 tongues, is a quintessentially English building called Bush House in central London. It is so vast, its corridors so convoluted, that it takes a new employee an average of 2 years to find his way around, by sight and by sound. What are the Thais listening to today?
This is the King's English from the BBC.
A program analyzing the lyrics of Elvis Presley, the King.
It's now or never. ครั้งแรกนั้นเอลวิสกำลังดัง
In this case, the King's English. They try not to take themselves too seriously around here, which is not always easy because they're taken so seriously by everyone else. And that's something that BBC correspondents are never allowed to forget, that their reports are heard inside those far-flung countries which they're covering. Lise Doucette, a 19-year veteran, was reminded of that while covering a political rally in Pakistan.
I got to the rally, was sitting on the stage. The head of this party got up and said, "They did it again!" And the crowd went, "Woo!" He goes, "They did it again!" The crowd goes, "Woo!" He goes, "The BBC got it wrong! They said it was this amount, and we know it's this amount." And the crowd went, "Woo!" like this. And I thought, oh my, this was my report.
Pakistani demonstrators are not alone in turning their fury on the BBC. During the Cold War, the act of simply listening to the BBC was a crime behind the Iron Curtain, where the BBC and its U.S. counterpart, the Voice of America, were known simply as the Voices.
They were voices talking to you. They were like your friend in the dark.
John Tuzo was with the BBC for 30 years, first as a reporter, then as managing director.
It was a voice in the ear, straight through to your mind, straight through to your imagination, and straight through to, I guess, in the end, your conscience.
And perceived as the truth.
And they were perceived as trustworthy voices, and they were always, and I think this was the most important thing, put to the test.
The story will continue after this.
Seva Novigorodzev has been a BBC voice in the ears of the Russians for years, broadcasting a pop music talk show which used to be jammed by the KGB because Seva used the weapon the Soviets seemed to fear most, humor.
Occasionally I would go overboard, very rarely, but it did happen on several occasions, and we had sort of minor editorial conflicts with the BBC.
With the BBC?
With the BBC.
You mean you were being too propagandistic for the BBC?
Because BBC has a charter, they have a style, it has to be balanced, and my vitriol was, getting the better of me. But
hang on. This is the Cold War.
Yeah.
And the BBC is telling you you're being too propagandistic. It's pretty funny, isn't it?
It's pretty funny, but it influenced my style. I had to write in a way that no editor would detect it, and that.
So you were trying to fool not the KGB but the BBC.
The BBC. Yeah.
The Soviets may not have liked the BBC, but many a Marxist has tried to jump on its air. Ask Josephine Hazley, an editor of Focus on Africa. Her program is so influential south of the Sahara that a guerrilla leader's first move after rounding up some Kalashnikovs is often to phone London and talk to Josephine. But I understand some presidents and some rebel leaders actually call you here in London to get on the air.
Oh yeah, they do. They tend to want to come to us because they think, oh yeah, if we speak to the BBC and they question us, people will take more notice. People will believe a little bit more of what we say.
It gives them an aura of credibility, of respectability.
Absolutely.
The World Service can be important to Western leaders too. Last fall, Dick Cheney called the Afghan section of the World Service, asking to be interviewed, and he was. When British Prime Minister Tony Blair put in his call, reporter Najiba Khosrai pulled a Mike Wallace on him.
I said to him that Afghanistan was used as a battleground. during the Cold War, and then it was dumped. How can people trust you this time?
You gave the Prime Minister a hard time.
I don't know, I hope so.
Khosrai, who was born in Afghanistan, has had her own share of hard times. After she fled Kabul in 1991, her mother, her little brother, and her sister were killed in the war. She barely spoke a word of English when she first arrived at Bush House 10 years ago. Now she's a World Service star, interviewing the new Afghan leader, Hamid Karzai, in Tokyo. But when the BBC interviewed Karzai's predecessor, the Taliban's leader, Mullah Mohammed Omar, it got scooped. He had already called the Voice of America in Washington. But the State Department stepped in and blocked the Omar interview from being broadcast because U.S. officials said it would give a platform to the enemy.
Can you imagine how demoralizing it is for someone who gets this amazing world scoop and then isn't allowed to go on air?
That could never happen at the BBC.
No, it would never happen at the BBC. My goodness, if we would have gotten that kind of interview that early in the war with Mullah Omar, it would have been plastered right across the BBC.
And that, it turns out, is the most remarkable thing about the Beeb. While it's totally funded by the British government, it has never permitted the government to influence its broadcasting. Not even during the Second World War.
Men were fighting the fires from the top of 100-foot ladders, shot up from...
Not even by Winston Churchill, who tried often and unsuccessfully to get the Beeb to play down British defeats.
If we don't broadcast the truth about the times when we lose, when the victories come, when the tide turns, they won't believe us either. So you've got to be consistent.
Churchill called you the enemy within.
It's quite easy to fall over into that sort of trap of being a bit holier than thou. That's why people like Churchill and others regard it as a pain in the ass. And then they recover and recognize that it's a pain in the ass worth having in the long run.